How many of you have had that conversation before with your doctor? I'm sure we probably all have. And there's this whole idea of trying to eat sensibly. This whole idea of sensible living. Trying to temper and measure how much we should be eating versus how much we exercise and what we put into our body. There's good foods and there's bad foods. And ultimately, our desire is to eat healthy. Our desire, and what our doctors always tell us, is that we should be eating sensibly. Solomon completely understood this. You see, we've been looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, and as we've been going through and looking at this man, and Solomon's doing something very fascinating as he writes the book of Ecclesiastes. What he's doing, he's almost kind of created a character. He calls it the preacher, and really it's him, but he's created this caricature. It's called the Koheleth in Hebrew, but basically it's this teacher, it's this preacher. And this whole idea is that he is there and he is the king. He has all these resources, unlimited resources. We've talked about how wealthy Solomon was and the ability to experience anything and everything. And so he realizes that life is meaningless. That's how he opens up the book of Ecclesiastes, that everything is vanity, everything is meaningless, everything is empty. It's like a vapor. There's nothing there. It's like when you open up a jar only to find out that someone has taken the last cookie out of the jar and then put it back, and you're sitting there, you open it up going, wait, what happened? I was expecting something to be there, and it's just emptiness. This is what Solomon sees and what Solomon is experiencing. And so he walks through and he tries to find meaning in life. He's trying and searching so hard to find something that just makes sense. And so what did he do? He went and he studied. He went to find wisdom. He went to find and he began to read everything. Solomon basically did things with science all back when. He learned everything and he was considered the wisest person ever to walk the face of the earth. Except for, say, Jesus. And then all of a sudden, he finds out that it's not really worth anything. So he says, I'll go and try pleasure, and he does everything. He goes, and we talked about last week about he experienced delights of all kinds, money, wealth, women, everything you can possibly imagine. And he found that it was empty. He found it was just meaningless. So this is what brings us to where we are today. Solomon is sitting around and he's trying to figure out life, and he's trying to figure out what has meaning. Follow along with me as I read from Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting in verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. So I saw that there was no more gain in wisdom than folly, and there was more gain in light and darkness. The wise person has eyes on his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceive the same event happens to all of them. What is Solomon saying here? What Solomon is saying is this, is that he's tried pleasure. He's tried the madness and foolishness of this world. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, right? We are told that we should live sensible lifestyle, right? We're told that there is a right way of living and a wrong way of living, right? And we always talk about the prohibitions of life and what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing, right? We shouldn't be getting drunk. That's obviously a bad thing. We should be making sure that we're watching our calories and eating our vegetables. Ultimately, there's this sensibility in life, and this is what Solomon here is weighing out. And he says, I've tried the foolishness. I've tried it. And it's like the darkness and the light. There's more to gain from the light than the darkness. When I first moved to Texas, one of the things that I was doing is I was working this weird kind of shift where basically I would work from 3:30 in the afternoon to 2 a.m. And so I would come home, it was an hour drive home, so I'd come home around 3, sometimes 4 a.m. in the morning, try to slip in without waking up especially small children, right? You're not supposed to wake up a baby. I mean, that's really some of the best advice I can give you ever. Don't wake a sleeping baby. And so I'm walking in, and I've got 2 small children. And I remember we would walk in the house we were renting at the time. When I would walk in, we would have this entryway, and there would be shoes everywhere. At this time in my life, I lived with 3 women. Well, I lived with my wife and then 2 small children. And wouldn't you know it, if you thought your wife had a lot of shoes, kids, especially girls, come with even more. I mean, it's crazy, right? And so I remember stumbling in the dark. And I remember saying, if I turn on that light switch, it's going to wake up Mary Kate, right? Like, I just knew if I turned on a light, it would bother her, wake her up, and then I'd have to put her back to bed. And it's been a long day, and I'm just looking just to try to just get just a couple hours of sleep before she wakes up in the morning. And especially if she woke up then, she wasn't going back to sleep, right? And so then it would be 4 a.m. and you're up with a 4-year-old, and that's just no fun, let me tell you. And so I'm sitting there, and I remember I would come in, and it was this game I would play, right? It would be dark, my eyes wouldn't be adjusted, and I'd sit there and try to let my eyes adjust to the light, but there was no light. And I remember sitting there going, I don't know what's out before me. If I could have just flipped on that light switch, I could just walked across that entryway without a problem. And there was one night I fell. I tripped on a little shoe of some sort, and I hit hard, right? And I ended up waking up Mary Kate, and I was like, oh. But the point being is this: if you think about the light and the darkness, how much more is there to gain from the light? And this is what Solomon is experiencing. He realizes is that I can live foolishly, live in madness, live in darkness, just chasing after every earthly pleasure possible. But it's going to be empty and meaningless. And there's more to gain from living in the light and living in a way that is sensible. So that's how he does. He starts living sensibly. A lot like our American dream. What is the American dream? I think it's summed up simply in the words of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And that's what we're told. That's how we're supposed to live. That is the end goal, isn't it? To live our lives that we can live it free, we can live it how we want to, and we can live it to bring ourselves happiness. Now, happiness can look totally different for each and every one of us. For some people, they will dive deep into that pool of pleasure. They will dive deep into just making sure all the sensations and the appeal to the senses can be had. Drugs, alcohol, sex, all these things wrapped up in the one, and we can live this way. But Solomon has experienced this. He's lived this, and he says, you know what? It's meaningless. It's far better to be on this side where I can experience this wisdom and knowledge and live this sensible life. And that's the case, and that's where most of us live our lives, right? I use this joke frequently. I think it's one of the best things I've ever heard, though. It's the quote-unquote 5 deadly Southern Baptist sins. I hope maybe you got it memorized by now. But what are they, right? There's no drinking, no dancing, no gambling, no smoking. So you got me messed up now. I'm forgetting it. Swearing, that was the other one, right? So as long as you're not doing those 5 things, you're doing well in life, right? No drinking, no smoking, no gambling, no cussing, no dancing, right? That's what we do. And as long as you're doing that, then you're living the way, the standard of this world. We're living in a way that is sensible, that makes sense. You're living in a way that's upright. But here's the thing. It makes sense. But what happens when that thought process subtly ekes its way into Christianity, ekes its way into church? You end up with the quote-unquote 5 deadly Southern Baptist sins. This expectation of how we're supposed to live. This idea of living in a way that makes sense. I was reading an article today, or earlier this week. It was named, I'm going to mess it up, I'm trying to say it's Atalantia Beaumont from Psychology Today. And what she did, she wrote an article titled, Are You Sensible or Senseless? And so she kind of laid out 5 traits of a person who is senseless and 5 traits of someone who is sensible. I want to look at those briefly because I thought it was very fascinating how she laid this out. And so the 5 things that she talked about that were senseless were expecting others to change their behavior, resentment, impulsiveness, pessimism, and excess. And doesn't that really define pleasure, right? You live in the moment. You live from one moment to the next. There's that impulsive attitude and behavior, that doing things that make sense now, but maybe doesn't make sense in the future. Living in that moment. And you've probably heard people talk about that and say, we need to live in the moment. We need to live in the now. Trust your gut. Trust your heart. And all these other things. But what happens when that ekes its way into the church? What happens when you start hearing these things and understanding that, and we start kind of pairing theology with it? It becomes a problem. It becomes a problem because we're letting the world dictate what we believe. So it makes sense, right? So we should keep those out. And so we look down upon the pleasure seekers of the world. We look down upon them and say, no, that's not the way you should live your life. And so we ultimately sometimes swing to the opposite end, the opposite side. And what she says is five points to live a sensible lifestyle is gratitude, making sure that you're showing people that you are grateful and being grateful for the things you have. I think I may have preached a sermon from that standpoint, being grateful for the things God gave you. How about following your own guidelines and not following the crowd? Well, of course, that makes sense. We're supposed to make sense from our life and make sure we're not letting the world dictate that. We're supposed to be optimistic, right? We're supposed to let God kind of focus us on what the things and what those opportunities are. And we're supposed to forgive and not judge. And we're supposed to live a life of balance where we don't live a way in which we're going to tip ourselves too far. Rather that we don't want to be in the excess, but rather just have enough to make ourselves happy, but not too much. You see, the problem with that thought process is that it's worldly. The problem with this thought process is not bad living this sensible lifestyle. It's not bad living over here and just basically saying, okay, I'm going to be grateful for the things I have. I'm going to make sure that I don't live to excess. And that's a good place to be. But the problem is that everybody can see kind of living in that that madness over there, living for that seeking pleasure. Well, that's wrong, right? And we can see obviously it's wrong. And that's what Solomon's saying. I can obviously see that is wrong. But what happens when we're on this side? And it makes a lot of sense. But we're not doing it with God. What happens is what Solomon has discovered. Going back to Ecclesiastes, verse 15. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity, that emptiness. For the wise there is a fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all who have been long forgotten, how the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what has been done under the sun was so grievous to me, for all is vanity and striving after the wind. I still love that illustration that Solomon uses, that striving after the wind, trying to grab onto the air only to always come up empty-handed every single time. You're striving, you're seeking. And so even on the side of wisdom, even on the side of knowledge, even on the side of he's saying, okay, we live our lives in this proper way. We write books, we understand these self-help and everything. That ultimately that you reach out and grab it, but your life, the end results are going to leave you no different than those pleasure seekers over there. And it's easy for us to look down on them, but it's hard for us to realize that even living a sensible lifestyle is still going to lead to the same result. Those are hard words to swallow. And again, I leave you from the Old Testament here going, wow, Mike, that's depressing. What is the point of walking through the book of Ecclesiastes? Trust me, it gets better. I promise you that. But here's the thing. We sit here and we say, if only I can be on the sensible side. If only I can just stay away from chasing after that pleasure. If only if I can just be here and stay here and make sure I'm just living by these guidelines of life, I'm not pushing myself too high or too low, that everything will be fine. But being on this side still leads to death. Making sure that your 401k is fully prepared for retirement versus someone who squanders everything still doesn't get you any closer to God. Staying in a marriage in which it's just you and your wife completely committed to each other versus going out and sleeping with every single person you can possibly imagine, it still doesn't get you any closer to God. Because it's the human situation that we are all in. We all struggle with the same thing and that same feeling, which is the separation of God. And we need to have some sort of filling in our heart. We need to have something to say, you know what, there needs to be some sort of meaning, because that's ultimately why Solomon is writing this book. What is the meaning? What is the purpose of everything? You see, Jesus understood this. Jesus truly did. And as he preached in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, one of the things he talked about that oftentimes is just verses that just go by us so quickly and so readily and oftentimes aren't looked at, but they're so hard to hear. Matthew 7, verse 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will I enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of the Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? And do many mighty works in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Solomon is not discovering anything new. Jesus in his own teaching is right there, saying it doesn't matter you living a quote-unquote sensible life. It doesn't matter if you're living up to the American dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What matters is, are you living your life? Are you following Jesus Christ? Or are you just making sure that you are just sensible over here thinking that's enough? It's real easy to see that this isn't enough. But it's really hard to see that both sides are going to come up short. And even Jesus says to these people, he says, there are some people, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. The one who does the will. What does that mean? Jesus is talking about someone who's listened to all the words previous in the Sermon on the Mount here and understanding that beautifulness of submission to God and understanding that there's something more that's happening there. Because ultimately we can live that sensible life. And think about those words that Jesus is saying right here. It said, Lord, do we not prophesy in your name? Do we not cast out demons or do mighty works? Think about that. What does that look like, right? I mean, what if I would start casting out demons right here? I mean, that would be pretty fantastic, right? I mean, Satan couldn't stand there, right? And I'm doing it in the name of Jesus. What if also I'm doing mighty works, right? And some of those other ones like prophecy and casting out demons, that might be a little far-fetched for us from our standpoint because that's not something we see in our culture every day. But instead, what we're looking at is we see mighty works. Well, what are some of the mighty works? Lord, you don't understand. Like, I went to church every Sunday. Lord, you don't understand, but I go work at a soup kitchen regularly. Lord, I go and I volunteer my time at the Montgomery Food Bank, right? And I move those things up and down. Lord, you don't understand. I care for people. I care for my aging mother or father. Lord, I care for my kids. I do all these things. You don't understand these amazing things that I have done for you. But the problem is, if you're doing it apart from the Father, if you're doing it apart from Jesus Christ, if you're doing it apart from Him, then it's just what Solomon says. It's vanity. It's meaninglessness. It's emptiness. You see, Paul, I think, really sums it up well here in Galatians chapter 20. I'm sorry, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. If you find Galatians chapter 20, we got to talk because there's something wrong with your Bible. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Life is vanity. It is emptiness. It is not something that can be held. It cannot be something that is grasped. And seeking the pleasure in life, seeking the sensibilities in life, it comes up short. Because it is not about you. Dave was so awesome. He was when he read a couple weeks ago, and then he referenced it today again, and when he talked about the story of David and Goliath. So often we think of ourselves as David, and if only I pick up the correct stone, maybe it's the stone of faith, maybe it's the stone of righteousness, maybe it's the stone of sensibility, and if I can just sling that at whatever giant, whatever monster that I'm facing in my life that I can't seem to escape, that will just be enough. But Dave reminded us something important. It's not us who fights the battle. We are not David and Goliath. We are the scared Israelites shaking there, seeing that there is something on the horizon and there's nothing that we can do. But God is going to find a way to slay our giants, to slay those things in our life. Are you willing to say the words of Galatians 2:20? Are you willing to say, you know what? I need to start living my life not for myself, not making sure that it's sensible, not seeking the pleasure, because it's ultimately emptiness and vanity, but rather I need to live the same way Jesus lived, that I've been crucified with Christ. The crucifixion, I mean, we sit there and we have cross walls in our houses. We wear crosses around our neck for jewelry. But it's a device of torture, a device of humiliation for the purpose that Jesus would be broken, so that because he was broken, that we might be able to stand up to the two biggest giants in our life, the two biggest monsters that we can never wrestle or beat, and that is sin and that is death. And Solomon points that out, doesn't he? He says, it doesn't matter whether I'm living my life this way or this way. It all ends the same for both the fool and the wise. Can you crucify yourself alongside Jesus? Can you no longer live for yourself? No longer live for the fleshly pleasures of this world. No longer live for the sensible ideals of this world, but rather live for him. Because that is what the gospel is truly about. It's about walking after him. It's about ignoring the world and saying, whatever you want, God, whatever it is, I forfeit my life for the sake and for your kingdom. The Lord's Prayer talks about that. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Do we honestly mean those words? Because God's kingdom does not look like this sensible American dream. God's kingdom looks radical and upside down. God's kingdom looks like jumping in a plane and going to some country somewhere and saying, you know what? I'm going to share the gospel even if it costs me my life. It means not being scared to walk up to someone in the grocery store and realizing as you stand in line, here in Texas even, that 2 out of the 5 people that you might be in line with are saved. That means there's 3 people who are lost. 60% of the people in Texas are lost. Or are we concerned about the sensibilities and not seeing the transformative power of the King of the universe, Jesus Christ, who has given everything to us so that we might be able to walk and be reunited in the love of our Creator? God's desire is to do something incredible, is to do something incredible through us, which I don't understand why, because he doesn't need us, but that is the way. He has created this world and he has put us in this place to have a relationship with us, but it's up to us to sacrifice our lives and be crucified along with him, because it's no longer about living for our flesh, but it's living for Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit that lives inside us. What is he calling you to do? Have you ever experienced the true gospel? Or are we still stuck on what it means to live a sensible life and saying, as long as I just check these boxes, I'm doing okay? Or are you seeing the transformative powers of Jesus Christ in your life and saying, you know what, I'm willing to chase after you with reckless abandon, that I'm willing to take up that cross and follow you daily to my death for your glory and for your kingdom? It's going to be a time of response. If you need to come pray with me, maybe you realize that you've never given your life to Jesus before and you're saying, you know what, I want to give it up for him. I want to be crucified so that I might be able to live and have Christ living through me and seeing the joy and no longer the meaninglessness of life. Or maybe you just need to stop living this sensible lifestyle over here and start living out the gospel truly. And maybe you need to pray and seek forgiveness from God for living that lifestyle. Maybe you need to start moving and saying, you know what, this is what I need to do. Whatever the case is, do not be unmoved at this moment in time. The worship team is going to come and let me pray. My challenge to you is simple. Can you live your life crucified alongside Jesus?